You know that feeling when someone tells you a story so wild, so absolutely unbelievable, that you just can't accept it as truth? Well, buckle up, because what you're about to discover about Sean Connery will shatter everything you thought you knew about the man behind James Bond. We're not talking about the polished Hollywood version you saw on screen. We're diving into the raw, unfiltered truth about a man who lived a life more extraordinary than any spy thriller ever written. And trust me, by the time we're done here, you'll understand why these stories were kept quiet for so long, and why they're finally coming to light now. Picture this. A young man standing on a bodybuilding stage in 1953, his muscles rippling under the stage lights, competing for the Mr. Universe title. Now imagine that same man, just a few years later, becoming the most iconic secret agent in cinematic history. That's not fiction. That's Sean Connery's real life. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where people start shaking their heads in disbelief. Before Connery ever uttered the words Bond, James Bond, he was living a life that most people couldn't even dream of, filled with moments that sound like they were ripped straight from a movie script. But these weren't scripted. These were real. Let's rewind to the very beginning, because understanding where Sean Connery came from makes everything that follows even more remarkable. Born Thomas Sean Connery on August 25, 1930, in the Fountainbridge area of Edinburgh, Scotland, he grew up in a working-class family that knew struggle intimately. His father, Joseph Connery, was a factory worker and lorry driver. His mother, Euphemia McBain, worked as a cleaning woman. They lived in a cramped apartment that lacked hot water and proper heating. Young Tommy, as he was called back then, slept in a drawer as an infant because his family couldn't afford a proper cot. This wasn't some romanticized poverty story. This was real hardship, the kind that shapes a person's character in ways that privilege never could. At 13 years old, while most kids his age were still figuring out their place in the world, Connery took on his first job delivering milk. He'd wake up before dawn, loading heavy milk bottles onto a cart, trudging through Edinburgh's cold streets to make deliveries. The money wasn't much, but it was something, and that something mattered to a family that counted every penny. But young Connery didn't stop there. He worked as a cement mixer, a coffin polisher, and even spent time in the Royal Navy. Yes, you heard that right, a coffin polisher. Imagine the young man who would become James Bond, spending his teenage years polishing wooden caskets. Life has a funny way of writing stories, doesn't it? His time in the Royal Navy was cut short, though. At just 18 years old, after serving for only 3 years, Connery was discharged due to a duodenal ulcer. For most people, this would have been a setback, maybe even devastating. But for Connery, it became a turning point. It was during his Navy service that he discovered something that would change the trajectory of his life: bodybuilding. At 18, he started training seriously, working on his physique with the kind of dedication that would later define his approach to acting. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, powerfully built, and determined to make something of himself. His fellow sailors nicknamed him Big Tam, a name that spoke to both his physical presence and his growing confidence. Now here's where the story takes its first truly unbelievable turn. In 1953, at just 23 years old, Sean Connery entered the Mr. Universe competition in London. This wasn't some small-time local contest. This was one of the most prestigious bodybuilding competitions in the world. Think about that for a moment. The same man who would later charm audiences worldwide as the sophisticated James Bond was once standing on stage in nothing but posing trunks, flexing his muscles alongside other bodybuilders, vying for a title that represented the pinnacle of physical development. And he didn't just participate, he placed third in his category. Some sources say he was third in the junior class, others mention the tall man classification, but the point remains. He was competitive at the highest level of bodybuilding. But winning wasn't the most important thing that happened at that competition. While he was there, displaying his physique, something far more significant occurred. A casting director was in the audience, and this person saw something in the young Scottish bodybuilder that went beyond muscle mass. They saw presence, charisma, and a raw magnetism that couldn't be taught. That chance encounter at the Mr. Universe competition led to Connery being offered a role in the chorus of a production of South Pacific. Can you imagine? One moment you're flexing on stage, the next you're being invited into the world of theater. That's not luck. That's destiny recognizing potential. Now, most people think Sean Connery just waltzed into acting and became Bond overnight. They couldn't be more wrong. His early acting career was filled with small roles, rejections, and the kind of grinding work that tests whether you truly want something or just think you do. He worked in theater, took minor television roles, and kept pushing forward even when the industry didn't seem interested. He was learning, observing, developing his craft in the trenches. During this time, he even worked as a nude model for Edinburgh art students to make ends meet. That's right. The future Sir Sean Connery, the man who would be knighted by the Queen of England, once posed naked for art classes to pay his bills. There's no shame in honest work, and Connery never pretended his path was easy. But before we get to James Bond, we need to talk about what happened in 1957, because this is where Sean Connery's life crossed paths with real danger, the kind that makes fiction look tame. He was filming a movie called Another Time, Another Place, opposite Lana Turner, one of Hollywood's biggest stars at the time. Turner was not just famous for her acting. She was a legendary beauty, a sex symbol, and at that moment in her life, she was involved with a man named Johnny Stompanato. Now, if that name doesn't ring any bells, let me fill you in. Johnny Stompanato was not just any man. He was a bodyguard and enforcer for Mickey Cohen, one of Los Angeles's most notorious gangsters. Stompanato was connected to organized crime in a way that was very real and very dangerous. During the filming of Another Time, Another Place, the on-screen chemistry between Connery and Turner was palpable. They were actors doing their job, performing love scenes and intimate moments that the script required. But Johnny Stompanato, watching from the sidelines, couldn't separate fiction from reality. His jealousy grew with every scene, festering into something dark and threatening. He became convinced that Connery and Turner were having an actual affair, and his rage reached a boiling point. One day on set, Stompanato showed up with a gun. A real gun. He confronted Connery, weapon in hand, threatening the young actor in front of cast and crew. This wasn't a staged fight scene. This was a genuine life-or-death moment. What happened next became the stuff of legend, though many people refused to believe it for years. According to multiple accounts, when Stompanato pointed that gun at him, Sean Connery didn't freeze. He didn't back down. Instead, he moved with lightning speed, grabbed Stompanato's wrist, twisted it with such force that the gun fell from the gangster's hand, and then beat him up right there on the set. Let me repeat that because it's so extraordinary it bears repeating. Sean Connery, a young actor not yet famous, disarmed and physically dominated a professional mobster enforcer. This wasn't choreographed movie fighting. This was real combat, and Connery won decisively. The aftermath of this confrontation was equally dramatic. After being humiliated by Connery, Stompanato allegedly ordered a hit on the actor. Yes, a mob hit. Sean Connery had to go into hiding because a real gangster wanted him dead. Think about how insane that is. He's trying to build his acting career, and suddenly he's fleeing for his life because he defended himself against a mobster's delusional jealousy. But the story doesn't end there. Just months after this incident, Johnny Stompanato was dead, stabbed to death by Lana Turner's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, who claimed she was defending her mother from Stompanato's abuse. The case became one of Hollywood's most sensational scandals, and while Connery wasn't directly involved in Stompanato's death, some mobsters still held him partially responsible for the escalating tensions. So when people say Sean Connery was perfect for James Bond, they have no idea how right they are. The man had actually faced down real danger, disarmed a genuine threat, and survived being targeted by organized crime. He didn't need to pretend to be brave on screen. He'd already proven his courage in real life. That kind of authentic toughness, that unshakable confidence, came through in every frame when he finally did get the role that would define his career. Now let's talk about how Sean Connery actually became James Bond, because even that story is filled with unexpected twists that people find hard to believe. When producer Albert R. Broccoli and director Terrence Young were casting for Dr. No in 1961, Sean Connery was not their first choice. In fact, he wasn't even their second or third choice. They wanted someone more refined, more traditionally handsome in that aristocratic British way. Connery was rough around the edges, Scottish through and through, with an accent he never fully shed despite elocution lessons. But Terrence Young saw something in Connery that others missed. He saw raw potential, a masculine energy that could be shaped and refined without losing its essential power. Young essentially became Connery's mentor during the making of Dr. No, teaching him how to wear a tuxedo properly, how to move with elegance, how to order wine, how to embody sophistication while maintaining that dangerous edge. It was a transformation, but not a fake one. Connery wasn't pretending to be someone else. He was learning to incorporate new elements into his authentic self. When Dr. No was released in 1962, audiences were mesmerized. This wasn't the Bond that Ian Fleming had originally envisioned. Fleming had actually expressed doubts about Connery's casting. But this was the Bond that the world fell in love with. Connery brought a masculinity, a hint of danger, and a sexual magnetism to the role that redefined the character forever. What people don't realize is that Sean Connery essentially created the template for every action hero that came after him. Before Connery's Bond, leading men in adventure films were often clean-cut, straightforward heroes. Connery introduced moral ambiguity, he introduced sensuality, he introduced violence that felt real rather than sanitized. He made Bond a killer, not just a hero. He made Bond attractive not despite his capacity for violence, but partially because of it. That was revolutionary for its time, and it changed cinema forever. Every action star from Arnold Schwarzenegger to Daniel Craig owes a debt to what Sean Connery created with James Bond. But here's another story that people struggle to believe. Sean Connery, at the height of his Bond fame, making more money than he'd ever dreamed possible, walking away from the role. After You Only Live Twice in 1967, Connery announced he was done with Bond. The franchise that had made him a global superstar, the character that had transformed his life. He was walking away from it. Why? Because he felt trapped. He felt typecast. The fame had become suffocating, the endless press junkets exhausting, and he wanted to prove he was more than just James Bond. It took enormous courage to make that decision. Most actors would have clung to that golden opportunity, milked it for everything it was worth. Not Connery. He valued his artistic integrity and personal freedom more than the safety of a guaranteed payday. Of course, the story didn't end there. George Lazenby tried and failed to fill Connery's shoes in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And the producers came crawling back, offering Connery an unprecedented sum to return for Diamonds Are Forever in 1971. Connery agreed, but with conditions. He negotiated a fee of $1.25 million, an astronomical sum at the time, plus a percentage of the profits. But here's the kicker that shows you the kind of man he was. He donated his entire salary from that film to a Scottish educational charity he had established. He returned to Bond not for the money, but to prove he could do it on his terms. And then he gave the money away to help young people from backgrounds like his own get an education. That's not the action of a greedy movie star. That's the action of someone who never forgot where he came from. In 1983, Connery returned to the Bond role one more time in Never Say Never Again, a non-official Bond film that exists outside the main franchise. The title itself was a joke, a reference to the fact that Connery had once said he would never play Bond again. But even that return was on his terms, at his pace, and it proved that his magnetic presence as 007 hadn't diminished with age. If anything, he'd grown more commanding, more assured, more authentically dangerous. Throughout his career, Sean Connery made choices that baffled Hollywood insiders, but revealed his character. He turned down major roles that would have earned him millions, including the role of Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Architect in the Matrix sequels, because he didn't understand the scripts. Rather than fake it, he was honest about his confusion and walked away from potential massive paydays. He accepted other roles in smaller films because the stories interested him, because he wanted to work with certain directors, because he was following his artistic instincts rather than his bank account. That kind of integrity is rare in Hollywood, where money and fame often corrupt artistic vision. Let's talk about something else people find hard to believe about Sean Connery, his near-professional football career. Yes, before bodybuilding, before acting, before any of it, a young Sean Connery was offered a contract to play for Manchester United, one of the biggest football clubs in the world. This was 1953, the same year he competed in Mr. Universe. He was a talented footballer, and Manchester United saw potential in him. They offered him a decent weekly wage, which for a young man from his background was incredibly tempting. But Connery made a calculation that shows his strategic thinking. He realized that a footballer's career typically ended around age 30. Even if he succeeded, he'd have maybe 7 or 8 years of earning potential. And then what? He chose acting instead, betting on a career that could last decades. That decision required vision, confidence, and a willingness to take a risk when the safe choice was right in front of him. His politics were another area where Connery refused to compromise, even when it cost him dearly. Throughout his life, he was a vocal supporter of Scottish independence and the Scottish National Party. This wasn't casual support either. He donated substantial amounts of money to the cause, used his celebrity to advocate for Scottish nationalism, and never wavered in his belief that Scotland should be an independent nation. This political stance created real problems for him. There's strong evidence that his support for Scottish independence delayed his knighthood for years. The British establishment, particularly under Tony Blair's Labour government, was not pleased with one of Britain's most famous actors advocating for the dissolution of the United Kingdom. Connery believed he was denied a knighthood in 1997 specifically because of his political views, and multiple sources corroborate this claim. He finally received his knighthood in 2000, but even that came with controversy. Critics pointed out that Connery lived as a tax exile, having moved to France, Spain, and eventually the Bahamas to avoid British taxes. They questioned how someone could claim to love Scotland so much while refusing to pay taxes that would support Scottish public services. Connery's response was that he paid enormous amounts of tax to Britain over his career, and he released detailed financial records to prove it. He argued that his tax situation was legal and above board, and that his support for Scotland wasn't measured in tax pounds, but in advocacy, visibility, and direct donations to Scottish causes. The debate revealed the complexity of the man. He was deeply patriotic about Scotland, but on his own terms, following his own logic. There's another aspect of Sean Connery's life that people struggle with, and it's important to address it honestly because ignoring uncomfortable truths doesn't serve anyone. In multiple interviews throughout his career, Connery made statements suggesting that he believed there were circumstances where hitting a woman was acceptable. These comments, made most infamously in a 1965 Playboy interview and repeated in other interviews, caused significant controversy, especially as social awareness about domestic violence increased. His first wife, Diane Salento, claimed in her autobiography that Connery had been physically abusive during their marriage, allegations that he denied. In later years, Connery attempted to clarify his statements, saying through representatives that he did not condone violence against women, but the damage was done. These incidents complicate his legacy and remind us that even people we admire can hold views that are deeply problematic. It's crucial to acknowledge this aspect of his life because hero worship serves no one. Sean Connery was a complex human being who lived through changing social mores and sometimes held views that we now recognize as unacceptable. His achievements in film, his charitable work, and his remarkable life story don't erase these problematic statements and allegations. They coexist, creating a complicated portrait of a man who was capable of both greatness and serious moral failings. That's the truth of human nature. We contain multitudes, and sometimes those multitudes contradict each other. But let's continue exploring the extraordinary parts of his life, because there's so much more to uncover. One story that people find particularly hard to believe involves a shark. During the filming of Thunderball in 1965, one of the most ambitious Bond films ever made at that time, there was an underwater scene involving sharks. The production team had brought in sharks for the scene, keeping them in a special pool on set. During one take, a shark got loose. Not in the ocean where it belonged, but on the film set, thrashing around in an area where actors and crew were working. Sean Connery, known for doing many of his own stunts, had to make a hasty escape as the chaos unfolded. The image of James Bond literally running from a real shark is both absurd and terrifying, and it's absolutely true. His commitment to doing his own stunts, by the way, was legendary. While modern insurance policies and studio policies typically prevent lead actors from doing genuinely dangerous stunts, in Connery's era, things were different. He performed fight scenes without stunt doubles, did his own driving in high-speed chases, and generally threw himself into the physical demands of his roles with gusto. There was one stunt, however, that he absolutely refused to do, and it involved a specific sequence that even he considered too dangerous. The details vary depending on the source, but the point is that this man who faced down a mobster with a gun, who did most of his own action scenes, who projected fearlessness on screen, was smart enough to know his limits. That's not cowardice. That's wisdom. Sean Connery's relationship with other actors and directors is filled with stories that reveal his character. Michael Caine, one of his closest friends, often spoke about Connery's generosity and loyalty. They met early in their careers, two working-class British actors trying to make it in a system that favored privileged backgrounds. They supported each other through failures and celebrated each other's successes, maintaining a friendship that lasted decades. Richard Harris and Roger Moore, who would eventually take over the Bond role, also counted Connery as a friend. These weren't superficial Hollywood friendships built on mutual benefit. These were genuine connections between men who respected each other's craft and character. His work ethic was another thing people found remarkable. Despite his fame and wealth, Connery approached every role with the same seriousness and preparation. He didn't phone it in, didn't rest on his laurels, didn't assume his presence alone was enough. Directors consistently praised his professionalism, his willingness to collaborate, and his complete commitment to whatever character he was playing. Whether it was an aging Irish cop in The Untouchables, for which he won his only Academy Award, or an Indian prince in The Man Who Would Be King, or a medieval monk in The Name of the Rose, Connery disappeared into his roles with complete dedication. Speaking of The Untouchables, let's talk about that Oscar win in 1988, because even that story has elements people find surprising. Connery played Jimmy Malone, a street-smart Irish cop who mentors Kevin Costner's Elliot Ness. The role wasn't huge in terms of screen time, but Connery's performance was so powerful, so memorable, that it dominated the film. He brought gravitas, humor, and emotional depth to what could have been a one-dimensional character. When he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, it was seen as both a recognition of that specific performance and an acknowledgement of his entire career. He was 57 years old, and it was his first Oscar. Many people were shocked it had taken that long for the Academy to recognize his talent, but Connery took it in stride, accepting the award with his characteristic blend of gratitude and slight irreverence for Hollywood's institutions. The roles he chose in his later career showed a willingness to take risks and defy expectations. The Rock in 1996 paired him with Nicolas Cage and was pure action spectacle, but fans developed a theory that's become internet legend. That Connery's character in The Rock, John Patrick Mason, is actually an older James Bond who was captured and imprisoned by the British government. The evidence they cite is compelling enough that it's become accepted headcanon for many Bond fans, even though it's never been officially confirmed. Whether intentional or not, it's a testament to how completely Connery owned the Bond character, that audiences could believe he was still playing 007 decades later in a completely different film franchise. Finding Forrester, in 2000, showed a different side of Connery's talent. Playing a reclusive writer who mentors a young African-American student from the Bronx, Connery delivered a performance of quiet depth, bringing vulnerability and wisdom to a character that could have been a stereotype. It was one of his final major roles, and it demonstrated that even in his 70s, his ability to command the screen and convey complex emotions hadn't diminished at all. His final film role was in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003, and the experience was so unpleasant that it contributed to his decision to retire from acting. The production was troubled, with conflicts between Connery and director Stephen Norrington, budget problems, and a final product that failed to meet expectations. Connery, who had always valued the collaborative process of filmmaking, found the experience frustrating and exhausting. At 73 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and with nothing left to prove, he decided he was done. He retired not with a whimper, but with a conscious choice to step away while he still could on his own terms. His retirement years were spent largely out of the public eye, living in the Bahamas with his second wife, Micheline Roquebrune, whom he'd married in 1975. By all accounts, their marriage was strong and loving, lasting 45 years until his death. Micheline was a Moroccan-French painter, sophisticated and intelligent, and Connery often credited her with being the love of his life and a stabilizing force. They lived quietly, enjoying golf, painting, and time with family, away from the Hollywood spotlight that had defined so much of his life. Sean Connery's influence on cinema cannot be overstated. He didn't just play James Bond. He defined what a cinematic action hero could be. Before Connery, adventure heroes were often one-dimensional. After Connery, they were complex, morally ambiguous, sexy, violent, and charismatic. Every action star from Clint Eastwood to Harrison Ford to Tom Cruise exists in a landscape that Connery helped create. His impact on the spy genre specifically is immeasurable. Every spy film, every spy character, every secret agent on screen is measured against the standard that Sean Connery established. Even when newer Bond actors try to differentiate themselves from Connery's interpretation, they're still defining themselves in relation to him. That's the mark of a truly transformative performance. When Sean Connery died on October 31st, 2020, at the age of 90, the tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow actors, directors, political figures, and millions of fans expressed their grief and celebrated his life. But what's interesting is how many of the tributes focused not just on his film work, but on his character, his integrity, and the example he set. Michael Caine spoke about losing his best friend. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon called him a global legend. People shared stories of his kindness, his humor, and his down-to-earth nature despite his fame. For someone who had lived such a public life, who had been photographed and interviewed thousands of times, people still felt like they were discovering new things about him, new layers to his personality, new reasons to respect him. The stories we've covered today, the bodybuilding, the mobster confrontation, the almost professional football career, the political battles over his knighthood, the real sharks and dangerous stunts, the friendships and betrayals, the triumphs and controversies. These aren't separate incidents. They're all pieces of a life lived with intensity, courage, and authenticity. Sean Connery never took the easy path. He made choices that baffled people, turned down opportunities that seemed like no-brainers, and stood by his convictions even when it cost him personally and professionally. What makes these stories so hard to believe isn't that they're false. They're all documented, corroborated, and true. What makes them hard to believe is that they all happened to one person. It seems impossible that someone could pack that much living, that many extraordinary experiences, that much drama and triumph and controversy into a single lifetime. But Sean Connery did exactly that. He was born into poverty and died with wealth and international acclaim. He started as a coffin polisher and became a knight. He faced down gangsters and charmed audiences worldwide. He was flawed and brilliant, problematic and admirable, complicated and authentic. The reason these stories were doubted, the reason people said, "No way, that can't be true," is because we're not used to real people being as interesting as fictional characters. We expect movie stars to have boring real lives, with all the excitement reserved for the screen. Sean Connery shattered that expectation. His real life was as dramatic, as filled with conflict and victory, as any screenplay. And that's what makes his story not just believable, but essential to understand. He proved that an ordinary person, born with no advantages, could through talent, hard work, courage, and sheer force of will, become extraordinary. This is why his legacy endures, why new generations continue to discover his films, why the stories about him continue to fascinate people. Sean Connery wasn't just an actor who played interesting characters. He was an interesting person who became an actor. There's a difference, and that difference matters. When you watch him on screen, you're not just seeing good acting. You're seeing someone who genuinely lived, who faced real dangers, who made hard choices, who experienced the full spectrum of human experience from poverty to wealth, from obscurity to fame, from struggle to triumph. So when someone tells you these Sean Connery stories and you find yourself thinking, "No way, that can't be true," remember this. Sometimes real life is stranger, more dramatic, and more inspiring than any fiction. Sometimes a poor kid from Edinburgh really does become a bodybuilding champion, face down a mobster, become James Bond, fight for his homeland's independence, win an Oscar, get knighted, and live a life so full of incredible moments that even documenting them all feels overwhelming. Sean Connery's life is proof that extraordinary things can happen to those who refuse to accept the limitations that society tries to place on them. His story is proof that authenticity, courage, and commitment to your values can take you places you never imagined possible. And his story is proof that sometimes, just sometimes, reality really is more unbelievable than fiction. You just have to be brave enough to live it.